This is Whitley Strieber, and this is Dreamland. You've reached the edge of the world. Today on Dreamland, we've got one of the most remarkable, if not the most remarkable, UFO stories in history. And you don't know about it, or if you do, you're pretty deep in UFO research. Indeed, this one is so remarkable that I think that my guest, who we will meet in just a moment, would agree that there may have been some efforts to just make this go away. My guest has been a UFO researcher since 1975. This is his first visit to Dreamland. His name is GrantCameron. He was recognized as both the Leeds Conference International Researcher of the Year and the UFO Congress Researcher of the Year. He's a world-renowned expert on UFOs, and you're going to find out that this is true. He's also cognizant about conspiracies, cover-ups, and has spent decades on the issue of UFOs and extraterrestrial contact. GrantCameron, welcome to Dreamland.
Well, thank you, Whitley. I'm honored to be on, and I appreciate your taking an interest in what I'm doing.
Well, it's more than an interest. I was absolutely riveted. You know, I've been involved in this in one way or another for 30 years, and I have to admit that the Charlie Red Star story was news to me.
Yeah, it was kind of news to me as well in terms of the fact that when it happened, it was almost like Roswell. If you recall the Roswell story, it came and it went, and nobody talked about it from 1947 till Bill Moore wrote the book in 1980. And the same happened with the Rendlesham Forest story, that it happened and it was a couple of years later until anybody picked up on it. And that's what happened with the Charlie Red Star story, is that I originally published the manuscript. The incidents all happened in 75 and 76, right just north of North Dakota in the Canadian side of the border. And I tried to get the manuscript published after I talked to all these people in the various towns and that had been involved in this, and looked at Minnesota and Wisconsin and all these places where the sightings were taking place. And nobody would publish the book, and the local publisher, and it was a very famous story here at the time in 1975, said to me, Mr. Cameron, you may believe in this kind of stuff. Count me among the unbelievers. And at that point, I basically said, this is a total waste of time. And I basically didn't try to publish the manuscript anymore. I gave it to my sister, and she's kind of the historian of the family, whatever. And 35 years later, she came back to me and she said, oh, you remember when you gave me this? And I looked at it, and I don't even recall doing the whole manuscript. I thought maybe I'd done a couple of chapters to try to get published, whatever. And here was this entire manuscript. And so it had disappeared basically because of me, because I had sort of given up on it. And in fact, the only reason the book is actually now being published is that there was a TV producer or movie producer out of Toronto, Canada, who wanted to read the manuscript and wanted to option it for a movie. And she wanted it published through a publisher. And she's actually the one that pushed it to go through the publisher. I had still basically given up on the whole story, even though now that I look back on it 42 years later, there are a number of aspects of the story that I didn't realize were significant back then that actually fit in now, in terms of synchronicities, in terms of the nuclear weapon connection to this story. And so now it's coming back on, and it is maybe the most popular book I've written, because a lot of people really they like the conspiracy stuff, but it's a little in-depth for them to read. And this is just basically a bunch of stories about this town that was basically inundated with this object that became known as Charlie Red Star, and that's the name that they gave it in the town. And so that's where the story begins and ends.
Well, before we get into this story, which I'm still sort of cross-eyed about, it's an amazing story, folks. You're really, get ready, fasten your seatbelts. But anyway, tell us a little bit about you and your work, because you've never been on Dreamland before. We don't know you. Yeah.
Well, basically, I start with this manuscript. And basically what happened is there was a bunch of reports starting in February of 1975 of UFOs being seen in this small town called Carmen, Manitoba, which is about 35 miles from the big city that I live in, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And I really didn't have an interest in UFOs that I can recall. I had an interest in weird stuff. Like I was into Edgar Cayce, and I had done at university, I had done a paper on dying patients in hospitals. And I had gone and asked all these questions about, do people predict their death? Does anybody see somebody before they die? Is there near-death experiences? And this is back in the 70s when the near-death experience thing started. So I was into weird stuff. But the only reason I went out was because these reports were coming in about this object that was being seen, and there was TV crews and people trying to film this thing. And we didn't go for 3 months, and we had agreed to go with my friend because we used to drive around the city and do nothing. And then the local TV station actually caught this thing on the ground. They had gotten it jumping into the air, and J. Allen Hynek had come down and got copies of the film, and NBC had picked up this film, and it became a viral film. And I said, come on, let's go see what everybody's looking at. And I always describe it as you buy the lottery ticket, you think, there's a chance you can win, but you're not going to win. And so we went out, and I didn't expect to see anything. And we drove into town, out of the town, in the town, out of the town. And an hour later, my friend said, if we'll go back into town one more time, if we don't see anything, we're going home. And I said, fantastic, this has been a total waste of time. So as we turn to go back into town, this object appears, and it's not a light in the sky, it's an object. It's in close, it's down low, flies right in front of the car. It almost looks like it's alive. It's red.
Almost looks like what?
It almost looks like it's alive.
Alive.
It was almost like a plasma type object where you couldn't really see.
What's interesting about that statement is that way back in 1947, when Kenneth Arnold had his first sighting, what he initially reported was that he had seen silver objects over Mount Rainier, flying along, skipping sort of through the air near Mount Rainier. In his later years, he also had the impression, thinking back, that they might have been living things. Did you know that?
I knew that, and I also realized that after I had my experiences and got onto other things, I got into what I think is the most important material of all, and that's the experiencer, which Kenneth Arnold was an experiencer, and that 13% of all experiencers, according to the Edgar Mitchell Free Survey, of 4,000 people who have filled out these hundreds of questions, whatever, say that they've been allowed to fly the craft. And when I got into that...
You know what?
What?
I tried to. It didn't get... They wouldn't let me.
Oh, they wouldn't?
God knows. They know me too well.
There you go. And all these people that I've talked about 36, and they all basically say the same thing. I say, how do you fly a craft? And they say, well, you do it with your mind. The craft is alive, and you become one with the craft. You put your hand on this pad or however it's described.
That's right. And I can tell you from my personal experience, you flow into it, and it's just like you became the thing itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's
amazing.
That's where this thing where numerous things I didn't realize until 40 years later. Then it just seemed like random sightings. It seemed like random events that were taking place. And I think you would have the same idea with your experiences, that at first you think it's random, and later on you start thinking, no, this may have been actually all planned and all part of a scenario that I was just like a pawn on a chessboard being used in this thing that they're unfolding, whoever the intelligence is.
You know, the Roswell tapes, the very controversial tapes of the dissection of the being and so forth, also include some images of handprints on a kind of control board with little dots.
Yep.
Those are real. I've seen those in my own life.
Yeah.
That is quite real. And by the way, folks, in the second half of the show, it turns out that GrantCameron is also very well informed about president's disclosure and UFOs, including having some ideas about Donald Trump. So in the second half hour of the show, we're going to get into that a little bit, because it's going to be very interesting. Hillary Clinton said that she would disclose, but she got defeated. What might happen now? Well, it turns out that there's some things to be discussed. Non-subscribers, free Dreamlanders, listen to these announcements, and boy, do I hope you just jump and do whatever they tell you to do. We're talking to GrantCameron, his book, Charlie Red Star, his website, and book presidentialufos.com, which we'll be discussing in the second half of the show. He's going to blow your socks off in both halves, though. Now let's get back to the control of UFOs. You're really the first researcher I've ever talked to who had any real idea of what that's like. And I keep my mouth shut because, you know, I don't want the media to start saying that, oh, Whitley Strieber claims to have been aboard a UFO. But, you know, I'm getting older, and I don't care. They're never going to believe me anyway, none of them. And so, yes, I have. And, yes, I have put my hands on those control panels, and I have had the experience of becoming the machine, the object, becoming like a living object. It's your whole personality and being go out into it. But then I was, shall we say, removed from this thing. And this is a very long time ago. And, because God knows where I would have decided to go. But it's an amazing thing. And tell us a little bit more about what other people have said about this.
Well, what happened with me, with my whole UFO career, I've just sort of been dragged through this thing. Very little did I ever intend. And what happened in this flying the craft thing is that I had a download experience that I've talked about to numerous people that happened watching Colin Andrews give a lecture in Phoenix, Arizona, where suddenly the answer to everything sort of came into my head and basically said, the answer to the whole UFO situation is basically non-local consciousness. And the three things that sort of popped into my head were a document from the 1950s. All this material I had collected, but it just put all these pieces together instantaneously in my head. And one was a top secret memo from the Canadian government in 1950, where they go down to the United States and they ask the Americans what's going on. And the report comes back to the Department of Transport and says, we were told by American officials that flying saucers exist. It's the most highly classified subject in the United States. There's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush who's trying to figure out the modus operandi. It's of tremendous significance to the Americans. And then what popped into my head was the very next line, and it said, and we were also told by American officials that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. And the Americans aren't doing very well because they've said if we're working on it, they're willing to exchange credentials and talk to us. And that's significant because in 1950, this is pre-Betty and Barney Hill. This is pre-Adamski. Nobody at that point is claiming they're talking to telepathic aliens. It was just UFOs flying around. And the second thing that popped into my head was a statement that was made by a guy we chased around, the former president of Penn State University, who he was the chairman of the board of the Institute for Defense Analysis, the top military think tank in the U.S. He had 14 honorary doctorate degrees, very, very prominent engineer in the United States. And we were asking him about the MJ-12 group. Is it still 12 people, and is it all still Americans? And the answer he gave was, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And the guy that asked him the question didn't have an answer, so Dr. Eric Walker answered his own question. He said, look, unless you understand about ESP and how it works, you will not be taken in by the control group. Very few people understand how it works. That was 1991. The third thing that popped into my head during this sort of instantaneous download experience was Ben Rich, 1993, is giving this lecture at UCLA, and Jan Hartson, the international director from MUFON, who's an experiencer, had this experience with a UFO in his backyard at 9 years old or wherever it was, wants to become an engineer and build flying saucers, and he realizes this is his chance. Once Ben Rich starts talking about the fact we've got the technology to take ET home, decides I've got to ask him, this is my chance, and as Ben is leaving the building, he goes to me and said, Ben, I've been fascinated with this subject my entire life. I need to know, how do they get here? How does the propulsion system work? And Ben turns around and says exactly what Dr. Eric Walker had said 2 years before. He said, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And Jen said, I didn't really expect a question, so he said, it means everything in time and space is connected. And Ben said, that's how it works. And he turns around and walks out of the building. And so when I had that download experience in February 2012, I started giving lectures on consciousness, saying that consciousness is the key to this phenomena. And unless you understand about consciousness, you're not going anywhere in trying to understand what's going on. And it was that point they set me up to talk to a woman who was in her 70s in Phoenix, Arizona, and I didn't really know what it was about. And she sat down, she started talking about remote viewing and psychic, and she's been abducted and the whole thing. And you just listen to the story. And that was that point she said, oh, and I was flying the craft. And I said, you were what? And it was 37 years into my career. I said, you were what? I was flying the craft. You flew the craft? They let you fly the craft? I couldn't believe it. And then she said, I've flown 3 different crafts. And I said, well.
Oh, I'm so jealous.
Yeah, she said,
I'm so jealous.
That's what she
I can't
said.
tell you how jealous I am.
Yeah, so that's when I asked her. I said, well, how do you fly a craft? And then she said, you do it with your mind. And everything made sense. And if you even look at now with this latest disclosure thing going on, if you look at this whole Tom DeLonge story, Tom DeLonge tells the story that he goes to Lockheed Skunk Works. He's talking to this Robert Weiss, who's the head of Lockheed Skunk Works, took over from Ben Rich, and the head scientist at Lockheed Skunk Works. And they ask him, how do you think they get here? And he said, well, he gives them a theory, and the head scientist says, well, that's interesting. What else do you think? And he said, I think consciousness is involved. And according to Tom DeLonge, the head scientist said, now you're talking. And he talked for 45 minutes, and according to Tom DeLonge, that's all the scientists wanted to talk about was consciousness. So
yes,
it's basically
and that
confirming
in fact, under the surface is all that matters.
Yeah.
Is consciousness, how to be conscious, how to experience non-locality of consciousness. And this is a very, very difficult thing to do. And the reason is that the personality, which is not part of consciousness, filters out so much. It filters out all non-local experience, which we all have. And you have to learn how to turn your personality or ego into a tool. Then you begin to be able to communicate. Yeah.
And then that's what I think they're teaching experiencers in terms of 54% of all experiencers.
They taught me.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have been able to say those words unless they hadn't been taught by them.
Yeah, exactly.
And the answer is yes, I can become non-local in consciousness. Yeah. And I therefore I am in contact. And so are a whole lot of people. It's nothing special. You don't get a special hat or anything. Yeah. It's just something that is perfectly possible to do. And behind the scenes, the government people are too. And they are trying to use this to find technology. And some of them are probably doing fairly well at it.
Yeah, and that's what is the latest thing that they're trying to push in this disclosure effort is this idea of the portal. And the portal basically moves us away from the idea that we've got some sort of spacecraft that goes at the speed of light to the fact that it's point to point, that you can actually move from one point in space to another point, and that consciousness is linked into this. And this is something that...
Yes. You have to get past the whole physical side of it.
Yeah.
A physicist will tell you, well, to create a portal like that, it's going to take an enormous amount of energy. And that's true at one level of being, but you go to another level and everything is different. Very different.
Yeah. And that's the basic thing that I've seen is that I learned over 42 years is that people make the assumption that it's a physical world, and if you come to the understanding that that consciousness is the ground of being, that consciousness creates the matter, and that matter is secondary, then everything starts to make sense.
Yeah. Also, another thing that people need to realize is that the UFOs, some of them are living beings, some of them are controlled in the way we've been discussing. But the ones we see are all involved in moving through the physical. But that is not the basic means of transport and movement at all. Yeah.
And that a lot of it is, or that is the plan. Like in terms of UFOs, where I always say to people, if you see a UFO, you're part of the game. Because
I'm so glad we're talking because, you know a lot of stuff. That's absolutely right. As soon as once you've seen a UFO, you may think, oh gosh, I just saw a UFO. You've been part of this all your life. And maybe before that in other lives.
Exactly. Why do UFOs have lights on them? So you can see them. I mean, we don't have lights on our planes, and if they want to, take somebody, at night, nobody sees them. So when you see them, it's intended that you see them. And people sort of think, well, that really is not that significant. And, you even look back at Bud Hopkins, who really didn't believe this, and yet, he started in 1975 with his first abduction case. But if you listen back in 1964 to this description that he had of the UFO he saw in 1964, he sounds like an absolute experiencer. He's sitting there.
Of course he was. I used to tell him that. It used to piss him off. He did not like that. He wanted to be outside of the context. He wanted to be a researcher. Bud did the world a tremendous service, and it was a hard thing to do what he did. But he was, he was the first. We still have barely scratched the surface. Hey, listen, free Dreamlanders, I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is that we'll be back. The bad news is do what you're told and listen to these ads. And above all, subscribe to Unknown Country. Boy, do we need you. I'm hurting over here. I have been for a long time. I've been very patient. So subscribe to Unknown Country. Now, before we go, I want to remind you we are talking to GrantCameron about a lot of things. We're going to be talking in the next few minutes in more detail about Charlie Red Star, this amazing UFO that happened in Manitoba back in the 70s. And then in the second half of the show, we're going to get into presidents and UFOs. It's going to be really very interesting. We'll be right back. We're talking to GrantCameron, presidentsandufos.com. Charlie Red Star is the book we are working on and talking about right now. Now, you saw a UFO. You felt like it was a living creature. That told me you know more about this than most UFO researchers. And so we went down a certain path together. And I didn't ask you whether or not you'd flown a UFO, and I'm not going to, because maybe we'll have another show. We're going to do a whole year on UFOs next year. You will be part of that, I'm sure. I would love to have you back and do a lot more about this. Anyway, let's go back to Charlie Red Star. What started happening? What did people first notice?
Well, I think everybody basically had the same thing as me. Like, people assume that what happens now happened then, but you got to remember that Travis had not been abducted yet, not till it was 1975 as well, the same year, but in November. So there was nobody really talking about the stuff we're talking about now. There was more just sightings, ground traces where they were landing, and that doesn't happen anymore. And that was my experience, was that I had a lot of sort of close encounters where I sort of fell off the edge of the earth. All my friends sort of went on with their life, and I would take tours of people out there to see these objects. And at one point, they had one of these ground objects. We called them ground objects, but they were like orbs. I got within 50 feet of one of these with an 8mm camera, and I just sort of got totally obsessed with the thing and tried to write the manuscript. And because I didn't get the manuscript published, it actually sent me down this other road to say, what was the answer to what I saw? When I first saw that object going in front of the car, I mean, my life just absolutely changed. And all I was interested in after nobody would publish the manuscript is somebody has to know what I saw. Somebody in this world is smart enough to know what's going on here. And that's where I went to the Canadian government. I went to the former president of Penn State University, and then I went to the president. I figured, well, the president's got to know what's going on. And then I chased the highest level intelligence people, and that's where I ended up in the last little while, is following Dr. Ronald Pandolfi, who I think you know who he is. And,
oh, sure.
Yeah. And his efforts to try
he's been working with, I don't know him personally. I know more than you would think about him, though. And he's also been working with Tom DeLonge.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah. And so that was what led me.
Wait, I'm sorry, folks, and please excuse me for these interruptions, but what I forgot to say is that Ron Pandolfi was the head. I believe he still is. Isn't he still the head of the CIA's Weird Desk?
Yeah, that's what we think, but nobody can really confirm because it's sources and methods, so we really don't know exactly what his job is. Except that,
officially we don't know what he does.
Yeah, except that
which is what he does.
He is inside the White House. He is. If there's a briefing given to the president, it's Ronald Pandolfi that does it, because one of the things I did in the year 2000 was I filed an FOIA with the Clinton administration for all the UFO material after I heard Bruce Maccabee had gotten a bunch of material, and I got the thousand pages of documents that dealt with Lawrence Rockefeller going to the White House and talking with the president's science advisor. And in those 1,000 pages of documents, when Dr. Jack Gibbons, who was President Clinton's science advisor, realized that Rockefeller was coming to the White House, he asked for a UFO briefing from the CIA. And we know for a fact, because it's in the documents, that it was tasked to Ron Pandolfi. And so this is already in 1993 that he's been at this a long time. I knew Lawrence Rockefeller and he was the one who really got the Clintons kind of started on this, I think. Yeah. But let's go on. Let's go back now to, we're going to do this in the second half of the show. Let's go back to Charlie Red Star. And what were people seeing? And how was it interacting with them? Well, as I said, like in 1975, it was a lot of just sightings. Later on, after I looked back, because then we weren't really looking into abductions, there was a number of cases where I realized that people probably were abducted. There was this little 7-year-old boy, one of the most dramatic stories that I heard of this little boy.
Yeah, tell us this story.
Yeah, he's standing on his front deck, and his parents aren't home, and this thing appears about 50 yards away over a tree on the neighbor's house. So it was very, 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 very close. And his mother believed it was the devil, so they weren't going to allow me to interview this.
When you say boy, it appeared, what did it look like?
Well, at first he wouldn't describe it. His father described the whole thing, and he said, he saw this, and I said, I'm going to strap you if you're lying. And the kid, when the interview was taking place, this kid was hiding behind a chair. He was on the far side of the room, hiding behind this chair. And his father said, come out and tell Mr. Cameron what you saw. And he wouldn't come out. And so the father told me the whole story about how the boy was sitting there, and this huge object the size of a house, it was on top of this tree, and the branches were breaking off the tree. And he was so scared, he went in and he got the rifle. And he's a little tiny kid. And he had never shot a rifle before, and he's trying to yell at his sister because his parents weren't home to come out and look at this thing. And he had a pet horse that had run to the barn. And so he wouldn't tell the story. And then I got a diagram thing of different types of UFOs, and I put it on the ground, and I leaned down and I got on the floor and I said, can you tell me what it looked like? And then he crawled out from behind the chair, and he took one look and he pointed at a classic saucer with a sort of a dome on the top. And I said, how big was it? He goes, big as a house. And I said, did it have lights on it? Oh, lights all over it. And then I said, what color are the lights? Different colors, all different colors. And he's whispering to me, and I said, did the lights change? He said, oh, it went all white, went in onto the road, and it moved onto the road a couple of feet away. And I said, did it go out like a light, or did it just disappear? He said, out like a light. And it was one of the most haunting interviews I've ever done. And he had the nosebleeds. They pulled him out of school. He was having nightmares and stuff like that. And I never went back to interview this kid like 40 years later, because I figured he may have gone along with his mother's idea that this was a demonic type thing.
Or he may have closed it off.
Yeah.
Like I know lots of people who were children who came to my cabin in the old days who had experiences, but if you ask them now, they don't remember a thing.
Yeah.
And they close it up. It gets scar tissue over it, because we can't, most of us cannot be comfortable in a world which makes no sense. You have to kind of get good at that. It's not something that we start out being very good at.
Yeah. And so there was a situation where there was like hundreds of witnesses. I did a poll at the high school in this small town, and over 50% of the students said they had seen this thing. So it was very, very high percentage of people. And then it just basically went away. And this is where I discovered 40 years later, when I went back, I was going to do a lecture on how I got started and this manuscript and stuff. And I went to the guy who owned the airport, who was a famous aviation guy who started the industry of rebuilding old World War II planes and stuff like that. And I said, Bob, why were they here in Carmen? And he said, you know why they were here? And I said, no, I don't know why they were here. And he said, I told you in 1975 why they were here. And I said, well, I don't know, Bob. And he said, I told you The missile silos. I told you they were the missile silos. They were coming from the United States. And it immediately clued on me because North Dakota, if it was there was always the story that if it was a country, it would have been a nuclear superpower. It had 300 Minuteman nuclear missiles, and we'd driven through North Dakota, so everybody had seen these missile silos.
The thing is, there were more missiles in North Dakota than people. It had been an interesting superpower.
Yeah, and what had happened was, this I found out like 40 years later, was that in February of 1975, when the sightings started, in a town called Nakoma, North Dakota, which is just on the other side of the border, they had put in 100 new nuclear missiles. And this was pre-Star Wars. When Reagan had it, they built it in outer space, and they were going to shoot the Russian missiles as they came out of the silos and in outer space and stuff. And in 75, they had it on the ground. So they had put in these 100 missiles, and they had 5 megaton missiles that were going to try to get the Russian missiles as they were in outer space. And then these little sprint missiles that if they missed, these sprint missiles would try to get it. Because the number one target of the Soviet missiles was not Washington or New York. It was the missiles in North Dakota. Because unless you take out the missiles in North Dakota, you're not going to see what happens. So this was the number one target. And so they were protecting these missiles. They made a negotiation with the Russians in November of 1975 to take these missiles out. And that's when the sighting stopped. So basically, when they had these 100 missiles in North Dakota, that's when the sightings took place. And so I asked, like, Bob, who owned the airport there, I said, Bob, how many sightings did you have in 75 and 76? He said, about 150. And I said, well, how many did you have after 1975? He said, I haven't had one since. So it was almost like they put drugs in the water and they took the drugs out. It was so clear. And that's where but then in 75, we didn't realize the nuclear connection. Now we know through various people who have written about the connection of shutting down Malmstrom and all these different stories.
Right.
Or if you take David Perkins, who has supposedly the biggest catalog of cattle mutilation cases, he says all cattle mutilations are downwind and downstream from nuclear power activities.
Yeah, I'm going to have him on the show. It's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating story.
Yeah. So these are things that we learn later on that fit in, that it makes sense when you it takes you 40 years to figure it out.
Right.
But back then it was just sightings and we couldn't figure
this. This is what's happening right now is we're figuring it out. Everything is coming together. Not only are the close encounter witnesses beginning to figure out what's going on with them, the government is beginning to figure out what's happening. The scientists who work on this behind the scenes are making progress. You can see some of that progress in the public work that Jacques Vallée has been announcing about isotopic ratios in metal that we have obtained from these objects. So it is definitely coming together. And it's not, but we're going to, in the second half of the show, we're going to talk about how will that happen? How will it come together? Will there be a mega disclosure moment or not? And what does President Trump think about this? If anything, does he know? And we'll find out because we're talking to somebody who does know. GrantCameron, his book, Charlie Red Star, True Reports of One of North America's Biggest UFO Sightings. We only barely scratched the surface of this terrific story. So get the book and get into it. You need to know this. This is important stuff. Just because the general media and most of the outsiders in science don't know what's going on does not mean it ain't happening and does not mean it isn't the most important thing in the world, which it is. Free Dreamlanders, goodbye. See you next week. Love that you come to the show. GrantCameron's website is presidentialufo.com, and Grant has made quite a study of presidents and UFOs. And Grant, I think that the best place to start is to ask you about why you started to write Managing Magic, the government's UFO disclosure plan.
Well, what inspired that book was Tom DeLonge. Tom DeLonge came forward, according to the WikiLeaks emails from John Podesta, that would basically confirm this, that he was claiming that he had 10 high-level government sources and that they were providing a material and that they wanted this disclosure to take place. And when I saw that, I said, I've seen this before. In fact, I've seen this many times before. I was actually around in the 1980s and knew Bill Moore fairly well. I had contact with Bill Moore.
Yeah, me too.
And I knew that Bill had all these various sources that, again, Bill, according to Bill Steinman, Bill told him that he had to work for the CIA as a student when he was at university. And that when the UFO thing started, Bill went back and remade his contacts inside the CIA and tried to get inside the government, which is what he did, and they started feeding him material. And so when Tom DeLonge came forward, I suddenly realized over the years that I've been in this has happened over and over and over again. There's a story of Bob Emenegger, producer.
Yeah, and you, Bob, as well.
Yeah, advertising executive at Gray Advertising, who was offered 2 documentaries to do for the U.S. government. The one he did for the Nixon administration, that he was close to Bob Haldeman and a number of people in the Nixon administration, and they asked him to do this documentary. They produced it, and then in the 80s, when Ronald Reagan came in, they came back to him and said, oh, they liked the 1971, can you do another documentary? And by then he was starting to realize, he said, well, is this Reagan? Like, who's asking for the documentary? And that's the one where they wanted to pull Jacques Vallée in and J. Allen Hynek in, and they didn't really want to be involved because they knew what had happened in the 1970s, where they had been offered the Holloman Air Force Base film, and at the last minute they pulled the film, and they figured Jacques Vallée used to call it the dangling carrot, that they were going to pull the rug out from under them, and so they didn't get involved. But at one point during that encounter, there's a guy by the name of General Glenn E. Miller, who was Ronald Reagan's first agent in Hollywood, who was running DAVA, which was the Defense Audiovisual Agency at Norton Air Force Base. And Bob tells a story of Hynek being there, and General Miller saying to the head of security, I want you to pull all the UFO film, and I want you to show it to Hynek. And this guy by the name of Paul Charles, who was the security manager, said, I'm sorry, General, I'll need a requisition for that. And he said, damn, I'll have your you-know-what. You show Hynek all the film. And the guy wouldn't release the film without a release. So there was these kind of stories that I had heard over the years of the government continually dropping bits and pieces of the story into the UFO community, but it's always plausible deniability. For example, Ron Pandolfi has been talking to, I've got over 24 researchers that Ron Pandolfi has dealt with, but it's always on a verbal basis. It's always plausible deniability, so that if you talk to him and then you repeat it, somebody will go to Ron and say, did you tell Whitley this? Did you tell Grant that? He'll say, no, I never said any such thing. So it's always plausible deniability. And the same with the president. It's like as far as they will try, you will never tie the president to the Russians. You will never tie him into Iran-Contra. You will never tie him into Whitewater, because it's always plausible deniability. They want to protect the president, and they want to protect the UFO story. So that's what they've done, is they do these leaks where they give it to people who have less than credible backgrounds. For example, Bob Lazar, the story of Area 51.
Yeah.
He was missing these 2 degrees. He claimed he had these 2 degrees.
They're building acceptance with these.
Yeah.
This is a way of, this stuff filters out into the public domain without any consequences. And so, there's a lot of people out there who are involved in this, and a lot of older people who right at the end of their lives announce that, well, I've been involved in this and now I'm going to tell the whole story. And they tell a bunch of bunk that's mixed up with some real stuff. And they've been asked to do that, just like General Exon was asked to talk to me. Exactly. And he did exactly, but then proceeded to say that most of the really cool stuff he told me I couldn't use. And so I put it in a book, a novel, instead of in a nonfiction book. There's nothing else I could do.
Exactly how they do it. Or they go through, if you remember back on the 65th anniversary of the Roswell crash, Chase Brandon comes out, who was the second top official in the CIA to speak publicly on behalf of the CIA without getting permission. And he was the liaison to Hollywood. And he comes out on Coast to Coast and says, I just want to let you know I saw this box at Langley, and it had this material in there, and it basically told me Roswell was real, it was extraterrestrial, and it involved bodies. And I can't tell you what was in the box.
But whether or not, here's the thing, and this is what I always say, whether or not it was extraterrestrial, we actually don't know. And we won't know that until and if the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, or some other entity with similar or different equipment manages to trace the origins of these machines, the ones that are machines. And goodness knows we're not even close to understanding the ones that are alive, or the ones that are biological, partly biology and partly mechanical. Or the ones that can accept consciousness as their motive power. I mean, this is really wild stuff going on. But go ahead.
That's where I say that if you look, I say, and I've been told, there are 6 teams. There are 6 people, 6 different organizations that are leaking this material. One is Ron Pandolfi is running, and the other one that a lot of people will get into the evil government, that there's these people who are trying to destroy the world for their children or whatever. And the people that I've encountered are all people who may be deluded, but they think they're saving the world. And one of the people that's supposedly running the Tom DeLonge operation is a guy by the name of Jim Semivan. And what people forget is that if there are 10% experiencers in the outside world, there are 10% experiencers, high-level government people. And Jim Semivan is one of those people. He's an experiencer. He was a presidential briefer, the same as Ron Pandolfi.
Yeah, he works for Ron Pandolfi, in fact.
Yeah, and so he had an experience in the 1990s where he had the beings in the room with his wife, and he said, when that experience shattered my view of reality. And he said the idea that we can measure this whole idea, we're going to use the scientific method and we're going to measure this and, this physical phenomena, whatever, he said is laughable. That's the word he used. He wrote a forward to Tom DeLonge's book. He said, this idea is laughable. How do you define something where there does not appear to be any there? This is something that's beyond anything science is going to get. It's got to do with consciousness or interdimensional. So he's basically saying that we really don't understand that much. People will sort of assume that we've got it all figured out. And here's a high-level guy who's basically saying, no. In fact, there was a story that was told that somebody asked him, who's running it, like in the government? Who's running this thing? And Jim Semivan's reply was, they are. They are in charge. In fact, there are these stories that they've actually abducted the president. That was one of the stories I had heard. That Jim Semivan actually confirmed that they had abducted the president of the United States, and that it happened during a news conference. And basically what they did is they shut the entire news conference down. So the only one that knew what happened was the president of the United States. He comes back.
Which was Eisenhower.
Well, no, we don't know who it was. We didn't know who the figure was. But this is the whole idea. And the idea was, we're just showing you, almost like shutting down nuclear missile silos, we're just showing you who's in charge. We're showing you we can do this kind of stuff. And getting across this point. The same as when you've heard the story about Perez de Cuellar, the Attorney General.
Oh, sure.
Bud tells that story, where they take him out of a convoy
Secretary
of 21
General
cars.
of the UN.
Yeah. So this is the thing, where they're basically showing that they're basically in charge, and that has this sort of this interdimensional consciousness aspect to it, that we really are sort of poking in the dark as to these beings that are basically running the show, are way beyond everything we've got. And these people in government, and I haven't met Jim Semivan. I've heard a lot of stories about him. Long before he became public, I heard about him. And there's also a high-level NASA guy who's a controller who I met at one point, and he actually made a pile of money. And you see that their situation is the same as you and I, that they're being ridiculed. And he even told me he sold a company for $100 million and had part to do with this invention that he got from a being. And he told me that his daughter was giving him a hard time. And Dad quit talking about this stuff, and he just said, let me tell you something. Remember where the Lexus came from. Like, he made a lot of money on this. And so his family was giving him a hard time, and he said to me, he said, Grant, I'll tell you what. He said, all I can tell you is the morning I woke up with that idea in my head, and this is an experiment they put on the space shuttle. He said, the morning I woke up with that idea in my head, the last thing I remember the night before was a hooded figure standing at the end of my bed. And, of course, the obvious question was, could you see its face? And he said, no, I couldn't see its face. So this is a high-level NASA guy, very high level. And people have to realize that. There are people inside the government who are experiencers. And if you take a look at people,
I know the guy you're talking about, as it happens. He's a good friend.
Yeah. So you get, like, for example, if you see, we talked earlier about the fact that if you see a UFO, you're part of the game. So you get the situation where Jimmy Carter saw a UFO, Ronald Reagan saw a UFO. So the question is, were they being influenced by the aliens? In fact, Shirley MacLaine tells the story, and I went to her webmaster and said, is Shirley being misquoted? Shirley claimed that she was told by Lucille Ball that the second sighting that Ronald Reagan had when he was coming down the Coast Highway, coming to this cocktail party in Los Angeles, that he not only saw a UFO, but that he actually had an encounter with the being.
Yes,
the being told him to run for president.
Well, I can assure you that there's more than one source for that story.
Yeah,
and that is, there's even no longer, but there was a direct source, and I think that fundamentally changed Ronald Reagan into a different person. He was one person before he walked over across the road to that UFO, and another person when he came back. Yeah. And another thing is Nancy was involved as well.
Yeah. And that's what people have to realize, is that you look at it as these evil government guys, and in a lot of cases, it's people like you and I, people who have been involved in this and are just basically trying to figure it out for themselves. Or like these Avery, who I believe you encountered.
Yes.
Various high-level Avery people who encountered the UFO phenomena in some way during their job in government, and they just got a little piece of the thing, and they were fascinated to figure out what was going on. Now there's stories. There's a high-level journalist who now wants to do a documentary, a book on this whole phenomena and talk to these people. And Ron has actually approved he's trying to get a documentary done in Hollywood on the Avery, and he dealt with a producer who I know the producer, and he actually told the producer, I want you to do this documentary on these Avery guys, and he introduced them to a bunch of them. And they're the names you've heard, like, Jacques Vallée and John Alexander and all these people
who have all been close friends of mine for a long time, but I'm highly unlikely to be in any of those documentaries for a lot of personal reasons having to do with what my actual role in this is. But in any case, I do hope it gets made.
Yeah, but you see this thing where you get Ron Pandolfi is actually instructing people to do these documentaries, and then they were going to change it to fiction. And Ron said, no, we've got enough fiction. We wanted a documentary. We want these people talking on camera. And so when you see that, you see a whole different story of the government, that maybe there's a cover-up, but there's also a bunch of people inside the government who are working hard. And I'm told there are 6 different teams who are basically out there dropping this material. And something has happened, and I even think there's a chance that the UFO subject has been declassified. That not the documents and not the classified stuff like the technology stuff, but that the subject. And that's why since January of 2016, I've been in this for 42 years, I have never even close seen the number of stories and leaks and stuff. And in fact, the one producer came to me and said, oh, U.S. intelligence said I should talk to you. And I said, come on, I'm not even an American. Why would U.S. intelligence say to talk to me? And they said, well, because you know about the Avery, they want to do this thing, and they tried to drag me in. And I said, because I knew what happened to Bill Moore, I know what happens to these people. I said, I will help you. I will give you whatever you want. I will assist you in whatever you're doing. But I would rather be a chess player than a chess piece on the board. Because if they tell me, and they actually said, we will put you on the inside, and we will tell you what's going on. You can be on the calls as to what we're going to do, or you can be on the outside and take 10 to 20%. And I said, I will take the 10 to 20% on the outside because I don't want anybody telling me, you can't talk about this, you can't talk about that. Whatever you say is on the record. But there are these piles of these people running around. Tom DeLonge is only one of a number of operations where they are about to drop a bunch of stuff. And Tom DeLonge, the figure that I've heard from inside is that there may be $1 billion of money going into this Tom DeLonge operation to put out these various stories. And he's only one of 6 different operations. And I'm sure they're working through, for example, the portal idea. There are 6 new shows that I've been told about this year that involve a portal. So how do
there's one of those shows is doing a lot of that sub rosa publicity where they're putting up on the internet these videos of portals opening up that are actually CGI. So there are shows coming along that idea but here's the thing. And this is, I'm not so sure that they understand this yet. Those portals aren't hard to use. it's not rocket science. It's personal. It's extremely personal. And, there are people out there who can teach others how to use them. Some people can use them already.
Yeah.
And, you can, but here's a much bigger issue. When you use the portals, why? What do you do with it? In other words, you may be able to walk on the soil of another world, but what are you going to do with this?
Yeah.
What are you going to do? Are you going to bring back a super cell phone or something? And this gets right down to the whole heart of this issue that is completely unknown and undiscussed. It is the question of meaning and how to do things that have meaning and what meaning is. And I'm not going to go into that more deeply right now. We'll start going into that more deeply next year. But until we understand how to address meaning for human beings, we're really not going to go very far.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the things I discovered after the experience with Charlie Red Star. It looked like a random event. And I think it's the same with you, is that after you've been at this for 3 decades or 4 decades or whatever, you suddenly realize this is really complex. And I say to people, it'd be a lot less physical than you think it is, and a lot more spiritual than you think it is. And that people don't like that kind of stuff. They sort of confuse.
No, MUFON's still having a lot of trouble with that.
Yeah, people confuse this with Santa Claus. They think, why don't they just land on the White House lawn, give us the free energy, and then get lost?
And then get lost, or plans for a starship so we can go take a look around, go to other worlds. And this universe is too conscious to have any interest in a bunch of primates wandering around in places that they don't know the meaning of.
Yeah. And that's one of the main messages that I think that the experiencers talk 54% of the experiences, according to surveys, say they are talked to about oneness, which the experiences I've talked to, that seems to be like a key message, is this understanding of non-local consciousness, of oneness, that everything is connected rather than our idea of separation, me versus you, good versus bad. And so there's different concepts that people really don't want to hear about, that they're trying to put across ideas. It's a long,
difficult life practice to get to the point where you are using your personality, your Grant or your Whitley or your Joe or your Mary, as a social tool, and you know and live by the fact that this is not you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's probably the biggest thing I've had is this idea that this complexity and the sort of the non-physical aspect of it and the meaning of life. And so basically the way I've sort of approached it now is all you really worry about is what is my role, especially if you sort of drag reincarnation into the thing, where we may have agreed.
You said it was complicated. You said it.
Yeah, we maybe have agreed to actually be a part of this awakening for the world, and so it really doesn't matter what anybody else is doing. I came here for some reason. I'm going to leave, and when I'm finished my life, I'm going to be asked the question how to work out, because you plan to do this, and all I have to worry about is what am I supposed to do, and I really don't worry too much about what everybody else is doing. I just live with this haunting thing that I must have agreed to do this kind of stuff, because I keep getting dragged down to one rabbit hole after another. And, okay, what have I got to do? And let's get busy doing it.
Yep, and that's right. And it's a very hard thing to face, because, you get I ended up in a very thankless task. I'm not going to have the kind of support that Tom DeLonge gets.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a reward, and that is that in a situation like I'm in, I get to really help the genuine side of this make progress. Because you're right, Grant, it's all about consciousness. It's all about what we talked about in the first half of the show, which is ESP and telepathy and becoming one, and getting to the point where the filters that you have in place, your ego, are a tool and they don't dominate your being. And when that happens, suddenly you realize you're not alone even inside your own mind.
Yeah.
You're part of something much bigger. And then what do you do with that? Where do you go? That's the leading edge of the human process of contact right now, is exploring that question.
Yeah. And the other thing that people have to remember, and I always, when I talk to experiencers, is because an experiencer, as you point out, is not the sort of the best kind of life. It's very trying. But I always remind experiencers that if you understand what's going on with this issue, you realize this is the Super Bowl of all stories. There is no bigger story ever. And you got to play in the Super Bowl. And it's not like, because sometimes you look at the bad things that are happening and the things, but you got to realize that you got picked for this thing, and that, like I remember Angela Joyner, who lost her job because of her association. I said, well, 500 years from now, Angela, your great-great-grandchildren will say, well, that was my great-grandmother that did that, and I'm proud of her. And because when you're going through it, it seems tough. But you have to always keep in mind the fact that this is the Super Bowl of all stories. It's the most important story of all times.
There's another wrinkle to this, speaking of a complicated universe. 500 years from now, Angela may be her own grandchild.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so that's where people aren't really at that aspect, but that's the kind of stuff I think they're trying to leak into the community. I think Bigelow called it acclimatization, or like an acknowledgement, where they're trying to move people gradually down the road. And I think people do realize much more now than they did when I started as to what's actually going on here. I think we're actually starting to understand who this intelligence might be and what the purpose is. Whereas in 1975, it was just simple, straight sightings. It was like ETs. We thought it was ETs. And now completely see it completely differently. Totally.
Yeah, how differently? Why not ETs?
Well, because of this non-local thing. Like I always say, the number one being, according to the survey, that is seen is not a gray or a human type. It's an etheric ball type being. So a lot of people will describe it's a ball of light that turns into an alien. So I say, well, is it a ball of light or is it an alien? And does a ball of light have bacon, eggs, toast, and coffee? Or the other thing I have with experiencers, and Betty Andreasen was one of the key ones that I asked, is you ask experiencers who've had an encounter with an alien, a particular alien that sort of tells them what's going on. And so I asked Betty Andreasen, you had your first experience in 46, and her husband, same thing, 46. I said, did the alien ever get any older? And she said, no, but aliens have a long time. And every experiencer says the same thing, like the alien never gets any older. Well, if we're getting older, why isn't the alien? Maybe it's not an alien. And some people, Sherry Wild, there's a couple of experiencers who have actually asked the being, are you actually an alien? And he will say, no, I'm not. And why are you doing this? And it's this whole thing of screen imaging, whether it's rabbits or that they can basically play with, they can come into the physical world, appear as whatever they want, change into whatever they want. But there's so many incidents where people are looking at balls of light and things that don't appear to be physical. And so I would call them almost like ultra-terrestrials. Like it may have an ET component, but it's much more complex than ET. It has this non-physical component, like they're in this lucid dream world or whatever it is, and they can come into the physical world and they can go back. But that's where Ben Rich said, how do they get here? ESP, non-local consciousness. You got to realize that it's not this physical world that you think it is. It has this other component. And unless you understand this oneness concept, and the fact that consciousness is basic, you cannot get off this planet. You cannot travel through time and space or to other places because we're locked into this idea that we need a big rocket engine and we need to go the speed of light. As soon as you understand consciousness, then you can go from one point, like an entangled particle, from one point in space to another, that there's non-local consciousness and everything's non-local, then you can move off this planet. And that's what's keeping us on the planet, is our belief in the physical world.
Right. It's a belief, too, folks. It's a faith. That's what it is. If you come to the realization that the physical world is not quite as physical a world as it may seem, you're beginning to go in the right direction. You're beginning to empower yourself as yourself. And when I say yourself, I mean two things. I mean you as your essence and you as the universe. Now, We're going to close out today, and Grant's obviously going to be with us a lot because he's got a lot to say. He's on the right track. He is an effective researcher. I can assure you of this. But I'm going to close with a great quote that you include in Charlie Red Star. And do get these books, folks, and go to his website as well. It's an excellent website. There's a lot of material there, but I realize before we stop, we did not discuss Donald Trump, and I want to. So let's go on for a couple more minutes. And why don't you tell us what you know about Donald Trump and John Pandolfi and the possibility that disclosure may come from this administration?
Okay. The way I discovered Ron Pandolfi, and I have checked every president, so as soon as I saw this, I was totally awake. A guy by the name of Robert Collins, who was known as the Condor in the Avery. He was a physicist at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I believe it was January the 6th, posts a message on his Facebook site that said, I've got a message from my good friend Ron Pandolfi, who got me an interview at the CIA, and he said, Donald Trump is open to disclosure and against disinformation. So I immediately started contacting everybody that I knew, because I've talked about Pandolfi a number of times in a number of books. And does anybody know what Ron Pandolfi's talking about here? And the one person who said, yeah, give me a phone call, I've been talking about this, is Dan Smith, who Ron has been talking to since 1991. He was his best man at his second wedding, godfather.
And what is his position?
Well, he's just his father was a high-level economic advisor to Eisenhower. He's sort of a rich guy, got two master's degree in physics, and just happened to be into crop circles and UFOs, and encountered Ron Pandolfi in 1991, and Ron chose him to leak all this material to.
Yeah, Ron Pandolfi has got a lot of people in his world that way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Jim Smith's not the only one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I say there's over 2 dozen. And so I went to Dan, and of course the first question I asked was, because the rumor was that Ron was the briefer, that he'd briefed 6 presidents. So I said, did he brief Donald Trump? And he said, yes, he did. And he stated this according to, again, it's plausible deniability, because Ron is telling Dan this. But if you go to Ron and say, as Stephen Bassett did, as soon as Stephen Bassett heard this story, he phoned up Ron and he said, did you brief Trump? And he said, no, I didn't brief Trump. No, don't listen to Dan. And that's the thing. It's just plausible deniability. But according to Dan, he had been with Trump every day, almost every day in December, and that the briefing team was like a software briefing team. There's a software briefing team and a hardware briefing team. So there's people who were into the aspects that we're talking about, the more the philosophical aspects. And then there's the hardware team, the MJ12 type thing, where it's technology. And the team that Ron is on is the software team, and it involved Ron Pandolfi, James Woolsey, who was Clinton's CIA director, and a guy by the name of Mike Pillsbury, and that they had met almost every day. And then the story was that they had given Trump what was called a goodie bag. And this is the same story as Philip Corso with the filing cabinet, Chase Brandon with the file box at CIA. It was the same story. It's just a recycled story, that he had been given these pieces of UFO technology that he could show to captains of industry, and that he was going along. He's not interested in the UFO subject, and he's said this publicly. But he goes along with the program, and he's allowing Ron and these other 5 teams to run this disclosure initiative, and that he's busy doing other stuff, and that he really is not going to involve himself with the project. So that's basically what we've heard. And that's coming mostly through Dan Smith, who said he's had a conversation with Ron Pandolfi almost every day for 26 years.
Let me ask you this. The materials were given to Trump physically.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know anything about those materials?
The only one I know about, Dan Smith talks about being on an island. They had a portal on an island called St. Catharines, which is off of Georgia. And there was a story that Trump was going to be brought there and taken through the portal. And Dan talks about picking up this object off a table. And it was a small, like a pillbox type object with a button on it. And the button was as big as the box. And he calls it an actuator. And these things are involved with these portals. And so he picked it up, and Ron said, I would advise you not to handle that thing, put it back on the table. And he put it back, and there was two people that Dan said he didn't know who they were, and that both of these people had been given, the one had been given this actuator item, and the other one had been given another item, and they were both going to New York City. They were going, and the idea was they were going to Trump Tower. So this was early on in the administration, January, somewhere in that period, or February. Other than that, we don't have any details, but these actuators keep coming up, that there's been two of them that have been recovered. And they keep talking about this, but they're talking rhymes and riddles. But one of the interesting things is that Ron Pandolfi's wife, her name is Aleha Pandolfi, is actually having events on GoToMeetings on the Internet where they actually host meetings. And I always tell people, if you want to attend one of these meetings and ask questions about the portal and ask all this sort of stuff, I have an email list where I will contact people when they have these meetings. And Ron's actual wife is running these meetings, and they're talking about portals and how portals work and where they are and this kind of stuff, and anybody wants to volunteer and stuff. It's just bizarre that Ron Pandolfi's wife is doing this openly on the Internet. So I would say people want to know, my email is whitehouseufo@gmail.com, and I will put them on a list, and they can actually attend and ask questions. And we've had, like, producers from Gaia on there asking questions. And one of the questions they asked was this idea about Ron trying to manage various people. And one of the stories that we'd heard through a very good source, a bunch of us heard this person tell the story, that after the movie Sirius, that Stephen Greer was very angry, and he said, okay, now I got to go back to Washington, I got to go to the CIA desk, and I got to report to Ron. So one of the questions that was asked at one of these GoToMeetings to Ron's wife, by Sid Goldberg, who was this producer from Gaia, said, is Stephen Greer getting his stuff vetted through Ron Pandolfi? Now, Ron is sitting in the room. He's not on the broadcast, but he's sitting in the room watching this thing, and you can hear him in the background yell out, what information? And so Sid Goldberg repeats the question. He said, I want to know, does Stephen Greer put his material through Ron Pandolfi? Is he getting assistance from Ron Pandolfi? And there's dead silence for maybe 10 or 15 seconds. And then somebody says, I think you just got your answer. So it's these kind of things where they're doing this right out in the open. And everybody can go on there, and everybody can ask whatever questions. But the thing is that people say they're interested. And when you go to these meetings, there's only like 15 people attend that are actually interacting with the guy who may be briefing the President of the United States.
Right. It's amazing, isn't it, that this has all happened and nobody's reacting. And have you ever met her, by the way? She's the most interesting person.
I've had interactions with her, but I've never, as I say, I always try to stay clear of the people. I don't really interact
me too.
With them.
They don't know I've met them. Most of them.
But she's
a lot like, in a funny way, she's very similar to John Alexander's wife.
Yeah, I really like her. I think she's really, really honest. She will, and I think she actually corresponds with people. That's where I say there's a major player in the scientific community that writes for a scientific journal who is actually now in contact with her, and she has agreed to talk. So we'll see where this goes. I really like her.
I hope it goes somewhere. However, you're right. There are two different approaches to this going on. One of them is materials, and the other is, if you will, reality and philosophy and consciousness. And what has to be understood is two things. The materials are an aspect of consciousness. This must be understood, and how that would be true and what that means has to be understood. Otherwise, you're never going to get anywhere with either thing.
Exactly.
And the other thing is, I was very amused by the idea of any materials being given to Trump, because the materials are like flypaper. You put your hand on one, and you're part of this.
Yeah.
You're part of this then and always from then on, because just as those little control surfaces take your chi and amplify it into the ship, touching one of those things makes something like a consciousness fingerprint on it that will follow you then everywhere, even beyond this life.
Yeah.
So it was a big thing to give him that type of material. They probably don't know what they gave him, and he probably hasn't any idea the significance of what he touched if he did touch it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to watch, though. It is,
yes.
It's really, really accelerating in terms of the amount of material that is coming out. In the old days, I mean, these kind of stories would be one a year, and now it's like almost every day somebody's giving me like a major story. Even yesterday there was a story about Dana Perino, who was the press secretary for Bush, has now been talking about the fact, about Roswell, and that they're covering up something, and there's all these people that seem to be surfacing, and this would never have happened in the way it's happening now. I just am floored by.
Well, there's a lot of material. There's a lot of documentation that has not been released, that isn't classified anymore. That's why John Podesta said he was so disappointed that Obama didn't release it. By the way, if Obama had released it, Hillary Clinton would be president, and I won't even get into what happened there. But suffice to say, it all unfolded on a different level as well as this one. Oh. In any case, because he and then Podesta concludes in that tweet that it's the law. And what he's saying is these certain documents are no longer classified under the tenets of the National Security Act. The reason being that they have not been found to involve national security issues. And they are things like radar tracks and discussions of the probable intelligence of the objects being tracked based on the tracks that were recorded. And that in the late 50s and early 60s. Those documents, I am quite certain, are not classified. They are simply hidden. So, and that's one of the things that's being talked about. In fact, I would guess I don't think you would succeed, but I think it might be possible to chip away at some of that material using FOIA, because after all, it is now in the opposite camp. It used to be illegal for them to give it to you. Now it is illegal for them to withhold it.
Yeah, that's what I've come to the agreement. In fact, in November of 2015, Obama goes and does an interview with GQ magazine, and he's asked about the having the Book of Secrets, and do you know what all the secrets are? And he said, everybody always asks me about Roswell and UFOs. And I just want to let you know that the top secret stuff isn't as exciting as you think it is. And according to what I know as a presidential historian, that when a president mentions a subject, it's immediately declassified. So it doesn't mean that the documents are all released, but that Obama was sort of greenlighting this thing that people could sort of talk about it. And as you said, like everything is hidden, almost like just because they've sort of declassified the stealth fighter doesn't mean they're going to release the plans for the stealth fighter or how the documents in the stealth fighter. But I agree with you that I think that a lot of this stuff now has been declassified, and that's why Ron and people like this are able to sort of walk around and talk about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's why Jacques Vallée is able to go out to consciousness in the desert and proceed to present what would a year or two before have been one of the most highly classified presentations on the planet.
Exactly.
And he presents it publicly, and people are all, oh, yeah, that's interesting, and then they go away. They have no idea what just happened.
Exactly.
None.
Exactly what's going on. That's my impression, and that's from 42 years, and it's accelerated big time.
Right.
What they're doing now.
Right. Well, this is the way it's supposed to happen. It's supposed to kind of ease out, and the big disclosure moment that people were all hoping for is never going to come, but what is going to come is gradually a realization, and I think it's the 21st verse of the Tao Te Ching that explains this method of governance, because you talked earlier about the visitors being in control of this. They are ultimately in control of this. And that verse is about bad government mediocre government, good government, and the best government. And the last part of that verse ends with, when the best emperor acts, the people all say, it happened to us naturally. Well, the best emperor is acting right now. And that's how this disclosure process is proceeding. We think it's just kind of organic to our culture and society, when actually deep, deep down in the recesses, there's somebody pushing a little button here and a little button there. And this is all coming forth.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Hillary Clinton before we go. I know that she knew an awful lot about this subject, and because Lawrence Rockefeller, he had them out to his ranch, and he brought the subject up with them at his ranch in Montana, and Bill wouldn't discuss it, but I think Hillary might have. So what do you say to that?
Well, as I mentioned, Hillary will answer everything if you ask her the direct question. And when John Podesta made this statement to this Dana, that done a video interview with her and said, next time ask her about the aliens, I knew something had changed, because this is a $1 billion campaign, and there's no way John Podesta would be saying, bring up the alien issue in a presidential campaign unless they knew what was going on, unless he'd gotten permission to bring this up, and he had polled it, that he knew it wasn't going to backfire. So Hillary has at every point, and she's actually talked about the Rockefeller Initiative in 2008, every time she's been asked about it, she mentions it, but she never brings it up herself. It's almost like she's only allowed to talk about it when people ask her about this issue. The other thing that is interesting that I didn't discover until years later was when I got the Rockefeller Initiative documents, it mentions the fact that all the documentation from Rockefeller to the science advisor, and from the science advisor back to Rockefeller, was going through the First Lady's office. And I could not figure out what that had to do with anything. And later on, it came down to this plausible deniability thing, that Rockefeller never got to the president. He only got to the science advisor, except at the ranch where Bill really didn't want to talk about it. But the whole idea was you have to protect the president. The president can't know. The president has to be this dummy who doesn't know what's going on. And so what was happening was all the material that was going from Rockefeller to the science advisor was going through Hillary's office, because Hillary would take it to the president. She wasn't then an official government employee. She would take it to the president and say, this is what's going on. And then Bill would say, okay, do this, do that. And it was going back, and it was this plausible deniability that she was the go-between between Rockefeller and the president. And it was unofficial, but it does appear in this one document that shows that everything that was being done with Rockefeller was going through her office.
Well, it's an interesting position to be in, I'm sure, for a person who knows a great deal, but is in a situation where they are constrained to not disclose it unless asked.
Yeah.
That can be hard. I can imagine that would be a very hard, indeed, situation to live with. Well, GrantCameron, we've said goodbye 2 or 3 times, I think. And I'm going to end now with this quote that I started to end with about 15 or 20 minutes ago from your book. Americans assume that facts are solid, concrete, and discrete objects like marbles, but they are very much not. Rather, they are subtle essences, full of meaning and metaphysics that change their color and shape, their meaning according to the context in which they are presented. This is a statement made by Dwight MacDonald in Esquire magazine in March of 1965. And folks, if you think carefully about that statement, as how it relates to disclosure, to UFOs, to close encounters, and to, for you contactees who are suddenly beginning to blossom with more information than you thought you had, all of you think carefully about those words, because in those words lies the path forward to understanding contact. GrantCameron, thank you for being with us.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Dreamland. Be sure to tune in again next week. Dreamland, is brought to you by UnknownCountry.com and its family of subscribers. Unknown Country was founded by Ann Strieber. Our news editor is Matthew Frizzell. Our coordinator is Amy Safrankova. Whitley Strieber is your Dreamland host, and I'm your announcer, Ted Alexander. Thank you for listening.